Welcome to our story about Minnie Stevens Brown. My name is Doris Reddy, a board member of the Hot Springs County Museum and Cultural Center, and with me is Racine Morgan, our previous director. We are telling Minnie Brown's story because of the fact that she is one of only a few people who had in her possession an original photo of the Sundance Kid and Etta Place, taken at the DeYoung Studio in New York City before departing for South America. After Minnie passed away in 1940, her photo albums and postcards were given to the Pioneer Association, and they donated them to the museum. We wish we had her letters or her diary. Minnie Viola Stevens was born in South Bend, Indiana in 1872. She had one older brother, Calvin Peter Stevens. He was born in 1869. Their parents were aged 53 and 40. When Minnie was age 2, her father died of malaria, and the following year her mother dies from cancer. Calvin was raised by a family member and then adopted when he was 11 years old.
In those times, life was tough. She told about living on the edge of the reservation as a young girl, and that she knew Sitting Bull. She said he was a very kind man. One day she was invited to join the native girls in a special dance. Sitting Bull saw that she did not have a necklace to wear like the others. He gave her one of his necklaces, and she cherished it for the rest of her life. Now that reservation would have been Standing Rock in South Dakota, and while living there, she also met Calamity Jane. That day, the cows were being a nuisance around the farmhouse. When Calamity Jane rode up, Minnie thought she was a man. Calamity took care of the cow problem, spent the evening with the family. She taught them how to make a lemon pie. Minnie said it was delicious. Now, these stories were taken from her interviews with various reporters. As a teenager, we believe she learned how to be a milliner, a hat maker, in the area of the Black Hills. Towns like Deadwood, Minnesota, Belle Fourche, and Sundance, Wyoming had hat makers, and they sold their wares to the brothels. She was in the area at the same time as the Sundance Kid. We believe that this is where they might have met for the first time. In January of 1890, at the age of 18, Minnie takes a stagecoach ride from Douglas, Wyoming to Buffalo, Wyoming. She had taken a train to Douglas, but we do not know where she originated. Prior to this time, we find her life quite a mystery. Now, the interesting thing is that same year, after she had arrived in January, Butch Cassidy, Al Hayner, and Manuel Armenta also arrived into Buffalo. And now the three appeared on the central Wyoming plains in early fall as the season was beginning to change on the front range of the Bighorn Mountains. According to the history records, the group stayed at the Occidental Hotel for most of the early winter. The reason for the group to be staying in the area at that time was for Manuel to race his horse. The name of the horse was Redbird.
In 1892, that was the Johnson County War in the Buffalo-KC area. One would wonder what all Minnie saw and knew about that event. She was very outgoing, never met a stranger, loved to flirt with the men, plus had lots of women friends. Many were associated with brothels.
Buffalo, Wyoming was a small town, and Minnie being about 18 years old and pretty, she probably knew everyone. In 1900, the census shows her living with Stanley Miller. Now, he was shown as the home renter, and she was his boarder. He was a cowboy who loved to gamble, drink, and hang out with the outlaws. So no doubt she might have met all of these outlaws through Stanley. In November of 1898, it was recorded she took care of Thomas H. Jones. He was stationed at Fort McKinney with the 9th Cavalry. He was the only black man in town, and unfortunately he died from the bronchitis. By January of 1901, Sundance had gone to New York with Etta. Him and Cassidy had done their last robbery and were headed to Argentina to try to live a normal life. The wedding photo was taken at the DeYoung studio in New York City.
In December 1901, Mike Brown of Thermopolis was at a Christmas dance with his wife Maud when she collapsed and died on the dance floor. She was only 21 years old. They figured it must have been her heart. Mike owned a meat market next door to the Skinner Saloon in Thermopolis. He was known to have been friends with the Outlaws also. Minnie set her sights on Mike. He had a ranch north of Thermopolis and was doing very well for himself. They legally married in 1907. They traveled to Cuba and St. Louis for the World's Fair. They never had any children. In November 1908, Mike purchased 35 lots in the Ellis edition of Thermopolis. Life was going well for Mike until December, when after spending the day herding cattle, he had stopped and visited friends along the way home. He always wore his six-shooters. Upon arriving home in the early evening, a neighbor hears a gunshot. He witnessed a prominent businessman dashing from the house and heading up the hill. The law was called to come from Lander, which took a good day and a half. In the meantime, Minnie was held at the Emory Hotel. While the neighbor and another person guarded the house, Minnie told the law that Mike had been abusive and had tried choking her, so she grabbed his gun and shot him. Because of that fact, they did not prosecute Minnie. She was released, and many years later, after most neighbors were dead and gone, Fred Winchester, a neighbor that had witnessed a man running from Mike's house after the shooting, claimed his life and his family's life was threatened, and that if he had ever said a word about what he saw, he would die, and so would his family. He wrote an article for the newspapers titled, "Who Really Killed Mike Brown?" He goes on to tell that he saw a prominent man running out up the hill towards his own home and that he had an invalid wife. Everyone knew that that would probably have been the mayor.
Stanley Miller also moves to Thermopolis. He is involved with the killing of Frank Sales, a young man who was the ranch foreman at the Padlock Ranch. He had been arguing with Jack Hollywood, who owned the Hollywood Saloon, about the bar bill. He paid Jack, but was headed outside, and they were still arguing. Jack took out one of his six-shooters and hit him over the head. Stanley was outside with them, and he helped to carry Frank into the back room and place him on a cot. Later, when the bar was closing, they went to wake him up, but he had died. He was only 29 years old. Stanley was charged as an accessory to murder. After several trials, no one went to prison. And in the 1910 census, Stanley Miller is listed as a boarder living in Thermop with Minnie Brown. And in 1911, Stanley Miller is sentenced to 20 years in prison in the Deer Lodge, Montana prison for bank robbery. He dies of natural causes while he's in prison in March of 1918. He had eaten his meal, lit up a cigarette, and just keeled over.
1912 to 1914, we find Minnie traveling a lot during this time. In approximately 1921, Minnie claims to have married a Mr. Lloyd. No record has ever been found to verify who he was or if it is true. She had traveled a lot from 1911 to 1920. She spent time in Hardin, Montana, while Stanley was in prison. Also went to Phoenix and Globe, Arizona, where she spent most of her time. Maybe she met him in Globe. In April 9th, 1930, Minnie wrote a letter to Ralph Barker, secretary of the Wyoming Pioneer Association, changing her name back to Brown. She said it was more poetic. August 23rd, 1927, Minnie's only biological brother, Calvin Stevens, is killed in a car accident along with Sheriff McFarlane, Deputy Ed Goodfellow. Him and his only son, Von Calvin Stevens, were being transported to jail from the Warm Springs area because of stealing military blankets and saddles. Vaughn died later, April 1st, 1930. He was born August 9th of 1903, only 26 years old. He was the last living relative of Minnie.
On July 14th, 1931, a note from Minnie to a telegraph operator concerning a letter sent to Virginia Hahn. Virginia Hahn was a daughter of Jim Bridger, and she wanted to come to live in Thermopolis with Minnie, which she did so. She spent approximately 3 years, and when Virginia passes away, Minnie takes her to Fort Bridger to be buried. On March of 1933, Minnie receives a letter from Carl Gray. He is the president of the Union Pacific Railroad. It's regarding the donations of mementos connected to items stolen by the Wild Bunch. I will read you the letter that was sent from the Union Pacific system. It's addressed to Mrs. Minnie V. Brown in Thermopolis. It says, Dear Mrs. Brown, I received your letter March 27th today, and also in a separate package the dictionary, prayer book, and scissors which belonged to Mrs. Hahn or her father, Jim Bridger. It was indeed thoughtful of Mrs. Hahn to direct that these mementos be sent to the Union Pacific, and additionally, it was very courteous of you to carry out her wishes. It is regrettable that Mrs. Hahn, as was also true in her father's case, was never able to secure adequate recognition and compensation from the federal government. The history of the territory through which the Union Pacific lines pass is so closely contemporaneous with the life of Jim Bridger that we have always taken an interest in his history and that of his family. General Dodge, who had charge of the location of the Union Pacific in Nebraska and Wyoming, knew Bridger very well and was very fond of him. The general saw to it that a suitable monument, properly inscribed, was placed over the grave of Jim Bridger in Mount Washington Cemetery at Kansas City. Some years ago, through a peculiar circumstances, we came into possession of a watch which Mrs. Hahn identified as having belonged to and been lost by her father in western Wyoming. It now reposes in the Union Pacific Historical Museum here in Omaha, and with it we will place the several articles which you have so kindly sent, together with Mrs. Hahn's books and any other articles which you may send later. In answer to your separate note about the watches which you state were part of the loot taken from a Union Pacific train, presumably when it was held up in 1899 or 1900, I will be glad to know, and I will assuredly hold in strict confidence, the circumstances under which these came into your possession. It may be impossible at this late date to locate the owners of these watches, but the department having charge of that class of records may be able to turn them up. Again, thanking you for your courtesy in writing me, I am respectfully yours, Carl Gray.
In September 1940, Minnie Viola Brown passes away. She is buried in Thermopolis in the Monument Hill Cemetery in a pauper's grave. The site has not been found due to years of overgrowth and no headstone. There has been a big question about who really owned the photo. Some people believe it was Mike and not Minnie. Minnie documented on the back of the photo and in her handwriting to say, "This gentleman is one of the real gentlemen who knew how to get the money and not cripple or kill." A postscript was added, "South America, taken in New York before he sailed to never return." She never referred to Etta.